And welcome to the July presentation of the Hazardous Material Transport Outreach Network's 2026 Summer Webinar Series. My name is Mark Warman, Community Outreach Consultant on Emerging Contaminants with Ohio Sea Grant, a HazMaTON member organization. My co-host for today is Kelsey Prihota, Great Lakes Transportation Extension Educator with Minnesota Sea Grant, the lead organization for HazMaTON. HazMaTON is a binational collaborative of specialists from the Great Lakes, Lake Champlain, Hudson River, and St. Lawrence River regions, focused on reducing risks associated with multiple modes of oil and other hazardous materials transportation through education, outreach, and relationship building. To that end, we are pleased to bring you our 2026 Summer Webinar Series. This year, we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of these webinars, and we'll host webinars once a month through the month of September. A few logistics to share with you before the presentation begins. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording with captions will be publicly available on Minnesota Sea Grant's YouTube channel and on HazMaTON's website. So I see Kelsey put that in the chat. Thanks, Kelsey. If you go to our website, you will be able to find webinars that you can watch previously recorded. You are also in listen and view only mode as a participant, and we invite you to submit your questions, comments, or if you have technical challenges, write those anytime via the question and answer box in your Zoom toolbar, which is at the bottom of your screen. You can upvote questions that you are interested in having answered live. We will be collecting those for a question and answer session that will take place immediately following Bill's presentation today. At the bottom of your screen, you will also find a button for live transcriptions and closed captions. Okay, so with that, I'm pleased to introduce today's presenter, Bill Zawiski. Bill has been employed by the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency since 1989 and is currently an environmental supervisor in Ohio EPA's Northeast District. Bill received his bachelor's and master's degrees in biology from the University of Akron. He has worked on permits for both industrial and municipal dischargers. He's taken an active role in the movement in this area to remove dams to improve the quality of rivers. Bill has co-authored several professional publications on dams and water quality. He also has worked on numerous total maximum daily loads in the district office. Bill has also taught environmental regulation and water resources at the University of Akron. As Bill gets his presentation set up, Kelsey is going to launch a 3-question Zoom poll. This poll and the post-webinar survey that you receive right after the webinar, this helps us understand our audience and find ways to improve our programming. So thank you for your responses.
I do believe it should be working.
Thanks, Bill. It looks great. I can see your slides, I can hear you, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. So we're going to talk a little bit about the train derailment that happened in East Palestine. I was assigned to be the lead stream person, water quality, sediment, and restoration for the state of Ohio. So stuff happens. I guess questions we might want to ask, why did this event gather the incredible national attention it did? And why was it public interest? I don't have all the answers, but why was the interest so great in this one compared to others? So we'll talk a little bit about it. Part of it was on fire, and it was with today's YouTube and Facebook and ability to share videos and pictures, it was rapidly disseminated throughout various social media events, and the flames and the smoke were quite spectacular. So I can understand part of the visual impact of it that might lead to it, but I don't know that that answers all the questions. I was called the very next day. This event happened at night. The next day, we were on the phone and the response had begun. This school building attached to a church was taken over completely by the response team. The response here was swift and massive. Hundreds and hundreds of people. I think at some times there were over 400 people working 24 hours a day to address the response. Ohio EPA initially was the lead on the response, and our director and governor were given daily press briefings. And our director in the left, Ann Vogel, is now the administrator of Region 5. She had just started at Ohio EPA as our director, and this was her gift, was to be living down there for like the first 6 months of her directorship. It was a derailment. It was a big derailment, and there was a fire. So when you look at some of this, it was a big deal. The trains, I'm sure they'll be talking about how this happened for many years, but from what we understand, there was some braking issues and a derailment happened. 500 more feet. This would have been in Pennsylvania and not Ohio EPA's issue, and also not a Region 5 issue for US EPA. It would have become a Region 2 issue. However, here we are. So Ohio EPA started out as the lead. US EPA had response buses and trucks I never knew they had. Equipment materialized on the site and the response had begun. So lots of people showed up. The railroad was very responsive in addressing the release and the spill, and the materials and folks and equipment were very quick to come on site. If we look at an aerial of the site, you can see something that says VC Area 1 at the top. That was the train track where the bulk of the derailment happened. In the cars, there were a number of chemicals. From a hazardous standpoint, there were several cars of vinyl chloride. There were some lubrication oils, some acrylate compounds, and sadly, there were 2 box cars full of beer that unfortunately died during the incident. You can also look at the bottom. One is called Tank Farm 3. This entire area became completely full of frac tanks. Once this happened, no water from the spill area and surface water was allowed to leave the site. So all of it was collected and managed in these frac tanks and actually hauled away as hazardous waste. In the upper right of the picture, there was a stream, and that was intercepted and a pump around occurred. So it pumped off the screen coming down to the left, where it totally was able to bypass the site to isolate and reduce the volume of water that needed to be collected. There was a lot of activity in the stream, so there was a release. So Mother Nature viewed this as a big spill, and our folks were in the stream along with all the other responders doing some typical emergency response. They were walking the stream to find the area of impact. So this happened at the very beginning of February. By mid-February, initially no one was allowed on site except for the hazardous materials responders, because the site was on fire and there was severe concerns that these vinyl chloride tanks could explode. They had reached critical pressures. The folks fighting the fire were not able to quench the flames. And one of the things that was chosen to do here was a controlled vent, because the folks that were responding had concerns that if we couldn't control the flames, things would explode. And a controlled vent was chosen to release and burn that material off. That's still something that lots of folks have. There's still discussion on it, but in my world, nothing blew up and no one died. So I guess at that moment, they chose what was the best options presented at the site. I wasn't there. I started walking the creeks mid-February after the flames were out. And I also had the pleasure of having a knee replacement in December of 2022. So I'm thankful my surgeon had really good screws in my knee. Standard, they were collecting parts of the spill. You can see that these folks culverted the stream. So this house is actually built on the stream that initially received the spill. US EPA, several weeks after the initial response, instituted an incident command. They issue orders and became the lead of the site. Whole bunch of cooperating agencies. So these Zoom, we did stuff through Zoom, but all of a sudden you had hundreds and hundreds of people across the country from all these various places providing information on these initial calls. We were on at least 2 phone calls every single day for months to update status and continue working through the response. It was, is, and continues to be very collaborative. If we look at the sampling, I have never been a part of something in my years at the agency that had so many samples collected, and we'll kind of go through and talk about this. But at the bottom, you can see 74 million gallons of water were shipped off site, and about 240,000 tons of material was excavated and shipped off site. Because the water and the soil touched vinyl chloride, all of that had to be managed as a hazardous waste. Digging and removal of material started immediately and continued through October of that year, 2023. They built a treatment system to treat the water, which was at the time when the spill was over and a major recovery had occurred. We were basically treating rainwater. It was still, because of the drive from mixture rules under RECRA, hazardous waste, and they built this entire treatment system to get a contained in determination so that some of the water could eventually be managed as non-haz and hauled off site. That was a treatment system. Heading into winter, there were concerns that this would potentially freeze, and they built an entire very, very large tent that was heated around this to keep things from freezing during the winter. Water was collected and stored in what we called BBTs, the big blue tanks. Each one was 1 million gallons. So from this, they would manage the water by either hauling it off site or running it through the treatment system. As that wound down, took the tanks out. We also had, during the response, so this was all done during the time period of February through October, there was continuous emissions monitoring occurring in the community. The 2 vans, you can see the one at the top was US EPA's, they called it the Taga bus. And at the bottom were the consultant buses that were also following it around. They would drive around the community about 5 miles an hour through all the roads around the area where excavation was occurring, continuously monitoring the air, which generated huge amounts of data. So this is just one little example of the data. All of this information is available on US EPA's website. So if you go on US EPA and even Ohio EPA, type in East Palestine, you will be able to have access to all of this information. As a part of the continued response, these were all dots representing soil. So where the darker concentration of dots are, that's where the actual derailment happened. The soil sampling was done around the area, so that included Pennsylvania, and they used a windrows to assess where samples would be, and then they also had to have folks give consent to have their soil sampled. There were a lot of agricultural concerns at the very beginning about what was going to happen to my farmland or to my livestock. From a standpoint of streams, where I come in, there were initially 20 sample sites, and each one of those things with a W marks the sample site. The inset on the right-hand side was the area of the derailment and spill. And every day, they collected at each one of these sites a complete scan for all the chemicals of concern and a whole GC SVOA sample all the way down and into the Ohio River. And those samples had to have a 1-day turnaround time and all had to go through level 2 validation. So when I talk to folks, I'm like thinking, do you know how much money this costs to have one VOC sample done with a standard turnaround? Now you're going to throw 20 on there and have it as a 1-day turnaround. And if it rained during the day, they had to do it all again to capture the rain event. Sampling is still occurring to this day, although the number of sites and the frequency has been reduced. And this just kind of shows the length of stream segments between each of these monitoring areas. And all those areas, especially in the left inset, those entire stream segments, I cannot tell you how many times I have walked them. Cool thing about having this data is that we were actually able to track the release and the spill. So the upper graph is right when, and it's an upper, this is an upper monitoring site. So near the release, you can see the peak of when that material, ethyl hexyl acrylate, was found. And if you look at the lower sample, that's on Little Beaver Creek, which is a very high quality, nice stream right before it enters the Ohio River. And you can see those peaks are delayed. That's the actual plume that's moving downstream. So by doing all this sampling, it started at the beginning, expanded a little bit within the first couple of days. They were able to track the plume as it moved downstream, which from a data standpoint is kind of cool. It wasn't so nice probably if you were the fish in the stream. The big chemical concern was vinyl chloride. Ohio has a water quality standard for vinyl chloride. At the very beginning, after the release, you can see there was a peak that did violate Ohio's water quality criteria. But upon collection and removal of the cars, control of the release, we have not had problems with vinyl chloride, which is what drove all of the hazardous waste management activities at the site. Hundreds and hundreds of sediment samples were also done. So they were sampling for a whole host of chemicals, including everything that was spilled and a whole bunch of degradation byproducts. So if we're thinking a lot of these areas, we're talking the VOCs, but then the base neutrals. So a lot of the coal tar compounds. This is coal country. So across the state, and especially in these areas, we find, benzoate, pyrene, and anthracene. They are everywhere and ubiquitous. So that was another bit of noise. What is the background that may say this is above or below that? So there was a lot of sampling and a lot of science, upstream sites, downstream sites, reference sites that went into these assessments. Another thing that happened is a lot of these chemicals, the acrylates, and there were the naphthalenes, the petroleum products, created sheens. And at the very beginning, there was a sheen assessment. So folks were walking up and down the entire stream segment looking for areas that sheen was present, meaning this material had accumulated, settled, got caught up in bank and under rocks. And we were looking for how did that sheen progress over time. Most of these chemicals have environmental half-lives around 45 to 60 days. So they continued over time to decrease. But at the very beginning, if you would go in any one of those segments and just throw a rock in, you would immediately get a sheen that would go bank to bank and move downstream, and you could smell it. The acrylate chemical smell will forever be burned in my brain. That's what some of the sheen looked like. And there were two basic distinct sheens. There was this opaque one, which was a larger one, and then you can see some little wisps of blue, the different chemicals. They were slightly different. I've been doing this for so long. A lot of oils or gas sheens. There's also yellows and some oranges that all find their way into that when you're seeing a reflection. These sheens were a bit different, and they behave like an oil sheen, but we were assessing this, and part of their requirement was that sheens were graded on a scale of 0 to 3. 3 being you throw a rock in and you go to bank, you have a huge sheen. 2s were something like this. 1 would be a little wisp, and then 0, 0. And they needed to achieve a 0 or 1 throughout the entire area. Historically, this entire section of stream, so the first receiving stream was called Sulphur Run. The next one downstream was called Leslie Run. Legacy pollutants were very, very prevalent in this, which just further complicated to was there or was there not a sheen. The uniqueness of these allowed us to generally say this was derailment related and this was potentially legacy. These were clearly derailment related sheens. Dumb luck is always better than skill. Ohio EPA, as part of our water program, does assessments throughout the state of Ohio and rotates on stream basins. In 2022, we did the Little Beaver Creek watershed assessment, which included the streams of Leslie Run and the tributaries to Little Beaver Creek as part of our normal water work. So we were fortunate in that we had current data to compare ecological response to chemical and biological. And we'll talk a little bit about this. So this is kind of the focus of what I was driven by. Lots and lots of community concern. So we would have lots of people walking in the streams, taking pictures and posting these pictures. Lots and lots of experts emerged who were very knowledgeable on everything. So that created conflicting discussions at times. I guess that's a nice way of saying it. Ohio EPA, as part of our basin surveys, was able to get into the Little Beaver Creek Basin in the years 1985, 1999, and 2022. gives us a nice spread of these comprehensive surveys. Our surveys include chemistry and biology, and we'll talk a little bit about those. Ohio EPA was the first state in the United States to have biological criteria as part of our water quality standards. So we assess macroinvertebrate communities using artificial substrates and also qualitative sampling. The Invertebrate Community Index was developed by an Ohio EPA entomologist out of our Columbus office. It has 10 metrics, and these are the metrics, and basically it's a score of 0 to 60. So think of it as a grade point average. Each of these 10 metrics is a class. Each one has a potential score of 6 points. We have reference sites all over the states divided by ecoregion, and that allows us to repetitively and accurately kind of assess this. In this case, we're talking about the Little Beaver Creek Basin in comparison to our legacy and our water quality criteria. We also do fish community surveys. So we fish using electrofishing, and we have different techniques depending on the size of the stream. And all three techniques would be appropriate, going from the headwaters, which was Sulphur Run, Leslie Run, down to the Little Beaver Creek, which would be boat sites. We also have the Index of Biotic Integrity, which was not developed by Ohio EPA. It was modified from Illinois, and it has 12 metrics. So each 60 points still, but it's a 5-point max per category. And just think, each of these is a class, and you get a score. And depending on the site, if it's a headwater site, a wading site, or a boat site, your expectations are graded by the size of the stream. So it would be unreasonable to find a 25-pound muskellunge in a stream that is 1 inch deep. So we grade our expectations, the scores, by what we expect to be in that stream. And it tells you, because between the macroinvertebrates and the fish, those are the animals that live in there all the time. These are our biocriteria, so that we're no longer the only state that has them, but we were the first. If we look at the Little Beaver Creek results and Leslie Run, that's the stream of concern at the bottom, you could see our 1985 survey and 1999 surveys show a lot of red. In our world, that's non-attainment. And those streams were bad enough. If you think of, like, since I'm in Ohio, you think of the worst streams we had. Many people go say, hey, the Cuyahoga in old days would have been bad, but the Mahoning River was probably worse. Well, this stream was actually worse than those streams. So between all the industrial activity that had occurred, the legacy stuff going on in the area of the derailment, the wastewater plant, and other things going on, you had a severely impacted system in the 80s. Upgrades and improvements, Clean Water Act is a big driver of that. Now you start seeing improvements. If we go to our 2022 results, because I know all this number stuff means something, what we need to see from it is that the entire system was now meeting and exceeding our biologic expectations. So at the end of 2022, we had a really, really nice community of both macroinvertebrates and fish. Talks about Leslie Run here. Sulphur Run was the tributary to Leslie Run. In our world, because that stream had been so severely impacted by culverting, City Hall is actually built on the culverted section of that creek. We call that stream what we write off as limited resource water, meaning people had done harm to it where it is unrealistic to expect it to function as a normal stream. So that was the actual initial receiving stream. For Leslie Run, it was a complete fish kill. So our Department of Natural Resources went out, and these are the fish they counted, and then they used their math because they didn't get in 100% of the stream miles, and they estimated well over 20,000 fish were killed as a result of this. So the spill, so now Mother Nature's viewing this as a spill. It was a complete fish kill in Leslie Run. Had a lot of community outreach, so I had to draft up all kinds of water quality documents to give the folks in the community who legitimately had concerns some of this information that we have on historic water quality. Where are we today? What have our data shown? We also made the railroad, their consultant, redo our complete assessment, and then they added a few more sites. So every site that we assessed in 2022, we made them go back to, and then we put in a few more, like Sulphur Run, for example, that we wanted to understand the whole ecological picture. Right in the middle of wanting to do all this, someone decided to replace a bridge, and they just decided to jackhammer it right into the creek of concern. They put a sediment bag in the middle of the creek. Needless to say, we were not happy about that. But when we're talking about all this social heightened awareness, this caused discoloration of the stream and a little fish kill, and immediately it got blamed on the railroad because that's where everyone was. So now we're trying to tease out these complexities and also alter our sampling. So the bridge that you see in the right dropped in, that is Leslie Run, about 10 feet to the left of where the upstream pieces of concrete, it's going from left to right. That's where Sulphur Run comes in. So this was like the site we wanted to sample, but we couldn't. And then if you're going to go immediately downstream and do biologic sampling following this, how am I going to tease out impacts associated with the severe sediment? And now you have fractured concrete, so you have pH changes. It created a lot of noise that we really didn't need to have. However, sampling was done in 2023, except at that site, and lo and behold, that stream had recovered. So biologically, you had a complete fish kill in February of 2023, and by July, August of 2023, that stream had biologically recovered. So fish that would have been upstream or in other little tributaries that were isolated from the impacts of the spill, the release, came back to that system very quickly. And this is just more of the data that we're talking about, showing that that community, in fact, did recover. So I talked to folks about this. If this had been 1985 and you were starting already with a severely impaired system, we would not see this kind of recovery. It could have been struggling for years. But because we started out so good, the refugia, the species that were in other places not impacted, were able to come back and recolonize and take over the spaces that the spill kind of eliminated the fish that were there, and now we have recovery. So ecological recovery. Lots and lots of recovery work done to collect sheens. Everywhere we found sheens, we had to come up with a strategy to remove those sheens. Sometimes if it was hung up along the bank or in the gravel beds, it might be excavation. A lot of this is they did a lot of bubbling, so they did air sparging to kind of release this. And this was occurring from probably May of 2023 into 24 and 25. So lots and lots of work that was done to address the ongoing sheen. The entire drainage network in the area of the spill, because all that material was excavated, fill and new pipes, everything had to be reinstalled. So the entire drainage area, this is sort of the beginning of that stream that I said they initially had to pump around. This is where it would come out. So as things started going back to normal, we're starting to see some restoration of pre-derailment flow patterns. Lots and lots of excavation, placement of fill. Every one of these areas became something that had to have flow restored. And we had this process where we, Ohio EPA, prepared a standard operating procedure of what to go through to restore flow. Once those steps were taken, I needed, because Ohio EPA was the lead on the stream stuff, I needed to be requested to allow the railroad to reconnect patterns of flow. And this was for every single sub-drainage area. And each of these little orange blocks represents a sub-drainage area. So as they cleaned an area, they would excavate the material. The process was, when the material was excavated, they did confirmatory sampling. And if you remember, because I know you all remembered the beginning numbers, there were thousands and thousands of samples taken of these soil areas. And then once they said they were done excavating, had to go back in and confirm all these samples that in fact the targets of the excavation had been met. Once US EPA confirmed that yes, indeed, you had met the targets of the area, they filled it in. And then we had to get actual runoff. So they're still collecting the material. We had to get runoff from that sub watershed. They analyzed it. If it met Ohio's requirements, so now if it was compliant with our water quality criteria, then they were able to present all this information to me, and we were able to piece by piece go through and allow them to reconnect flow back to what we're calling pre-derailment flow patterns. And that's what stuff is looking like today. So you're seeing tremendous amounts of effort. And the last I heard, the total cost of this was well over $1 billion between sampling and all the efforts going on. So it was truly something that was amazing to watch, and it was incredibly massive, the response. So that's my story. I'm here to answer questions, and I'm done on time.
Thank you so much, Bill. Yeah, appreciate the promptness with your presentation, because that does let us have a little bit of Q&A time. But also you were very thorough with your presentation, and we appreciate that very much as well. So, okay, folks, couple of ways you can ask questions. So, you can either enter questions into the Q&A box, and I will read them out loud to Bill. If you prefer to ask your question verbally, then you can raise your hand, and how that works is at the bottom of your toolbar, there's the raise hand. I will ask you to unmute, and then you can unmute and ask your question verbally. So a couple of ways we can come at this, but with that, let's get started, Bill. Okay, our first question is, were any COC concentrations, and I read that acronym as contaminants of concern, detected in the Ohio River surface water and or sediment samples?
So the answer is yes. We saw pictures of the sample results showing that plume cascading down. So initially there were. So part of this response is, or Sanko now is the group that deals with the Ohio River quality, and they were part of our communications network. So they were able to respond to the intakes on the Ohio River with, is there a reason to be concerned? So it was when I talked to the folks that responded to railroad spills, they're like, this one's not even in our top 10. It was easy access. I mean, they've gone through in West Virginia where they've been hundreds of feet down in a valley. So it was easy access to respond. And we had this quick way of cleaning it up. So, yes, chemicals of concern were noted in various areas, but they were not at levels of violation.
Okay. Okay. Important distinction. And question from Geneva. We know people like to get involved during an incident, community members, and the aftermath. Were there ways to deflect curiosity and well-meaning nosiness into citizen science data collection, volunteering efforts, or any other peripheral ways for community members to get involved in a productive way?
So I'm going to start with the yes. US EPA had a really good public information officer that was on the site, and they started basically a citizen tag, a technical assistance group, and they had initially it was more frequent than monthly, but eventually they had these monthly meetings where this concerned citizen group would get together, and different people would give updates. So this water quality talk and just really focused on the fish and the bugs and stuff, I gave to that group. And then there was interaction, and anyone that had questions was able to run them through US EPA, and we would all get responses to them. So, from that standpoint, there were really good attempts to do that, but not everyone, let's say, in the area was on the same page. But all we could do is provide data and information.
Right, right. Okay. Interesting. All right. So, a question that I have is,
Uh-oh.
I'm just wondering overall, you're looking, this is 2023 and looking back on everything, and it's still ongoing. It's not over, but what's been the most surprising part of this, like, remediation, restoration effort that you've undertaken over these past few years?
I guess the thing that is, I still find, I mean, for all the years I've worked here, let's say just awe inspiring is the massiveness of this response. Because, like the Ohio River, when I first started working at the agency up in Pennsylvania, they had, it was a 2 million gallon oil tank split at the seams and blew all that into the river. So you had, and now to me, that's a big deal because you had the Coast Guard in front of this plume telling all these water plants, fill up now, you got to shut off in an hour.
Right.
And this event, that goes back to my initial question, why? And I don't know the answer. I mean, there's people are going to be speculating why, but overall, I was just incredibly impressed at the response, the collaboration. We didn't completely agree because you had this massive team of consultants that were working on behalf of the railroad. US EPA was there and their consultants, so their support staff, and us. It was just this incredible effort. Generally, we were all pulling in the same direction, and I found that to be very refreshing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would imagine that also made everyone's jobs a little bit easier.
One would hope.
Yeah. Um, you addressed this a little bit in your talk, but I was surprised when you showed the picture of the house that's located like directly on top of the stream that was like the first point of impact for the spill, and this giant culvert, and so this is a very urbanized stream. So, like, when it comes to, cleanup is one thing, and I'm sure that's challenging in an urbanized stream environment like that. But then also, like when it comes to restoration, like how do you think about that with such an urbanized stream? Like you're not gonna be able to restore it back to like an ecologically natural environment because there's this whole infrastructure that's built around it. So like how does that work in practice?
So a lot of it goes back to trying to discern between what was a derailment related impact and what was a non-derailment. So, for example, right where the railroad ditches entered this stream, this impacted stream, Sulphur Run, there was an old abandoned gas station with leaking tanks, and you had 50 foot of bank that the oil was just seeping out. And as you walked upstream or downstream, you could just smell the old petroleum. We went upstream a little bit. There was a small engine lawnmower repair shop where, when we first got there, they didn't empty the gas tanks out by collecting the gas. They cut the gas feed lines and let it leak onto the ground. And so when we're in the work doing our stream stuff, you'd be digging or moving stuff to see if there's a sheen. And a couple of times we hit it, and all of a sudden there's seeps of oil coming out. People had filled in the stream. We'd find used oil filters downstream, buried in the stream banks. So that was part of the cleanup, was clean up to the maximum extent probable for your stuff, and you needed to justify and document why you couldn't. And then these other sites, these were these ongoing things. So the restoration in some of these areas is a little tricky. And it was a lot of work. They had 100-pound concrete slabs that we had to flip every one of them to wash and make sure no sheen. The sheen would hang up under the rocks. And the stream itself, when you got in the Leslie Run, is a very bedrock dominated stream. And there were boulders and slabs, and anything that was kind of angled facing upstream, the sheen would get pushed under it, the chemical when it came, and then when you'd flip it, you'd get sheen. So unfortunately, just about every salamander hidey spot in that stream we had flipped over to try and release sheen that was hung up on that stuff. So
Okay.
a lot of physical labor went into cleaning this stuff up.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. And then uh oh, Mark Warman, you raised your hand.
I'll answer or I'll ask the question live.
Oh boy.
Yes.
Thanks, Bill. I think I saw maybe a slide in your presentation. Could you explain where the soil that was contaminated and where the water that was considered hazardous, where it was sent? Was it incinerated, buried, landfilled?
So anything that went off site had to go to a US EPA approved landfill for that material. So, and this is one of the weird things. Okay. So this is the stigma. You had them shipping rainwater, and it's just personal gripe, but you had them shipping basically rainwater off site that was called hazardous waste because it had touched vinyl chloride, but chemically we knew it wasn't. And everyone was, a lot of places wouldn't take the water because they're freaking out because it's from East Palestine. But you're sending real hazardous waste to these sites versus having to incinerate rainwater. And so that's kind of, there was this mystique aura around everything from East Palestine. So we initially wanted all the water because again, it's rainwater. They were going to run it through a fancy treatment system that had both activated carbon and air stripping, and go to the wastewater plant to be treated. They were spending, I don't know, $5-6 a gallon to haul this stuff off site. If the wastewater plant could have got clean water, which we don't like, but because it was called this, the community didn't want that. And we're like, it's rainwater. You guys are going to make a lot of money if you accept this. But there was just, and that's part of that public perception. There was some perception going on, and they had a truck leak up in Geauga Parks, and they were freaking out. And I'm like, it's rainwater. So that's the part I don't understand. There was collectively everything had to be managed appropriately, so it all went multiple states around the region. Some of it actually was trucked down to Texas, and this was by semis, so each one was a load going down. So depending on who could take it, because there were also, if you're an incinerator, you have a capacity in your permit. You know, you got a RECRA permit through US EPA. You got a capacity. They just didn't want to take all one site, so it got farmed out to anyone that in the big picture was authorized by US EPA to take it.
Thank you.
Okay. And last question as we're wrapping up, how long is the post cleanup, post restoration monitoring plan to continue? And particularly for like the fish communities that were kind of completely wiped out like immediately post spill, like what does that look like? How do you know when you're done?
So ecologically, we're done. We had them do the sampling in 23 and then again in 24, and the results were the same.
Okay.
So from an ecological recovery standpoint, we're complete. They are working on a consent decree. So US EPA, there's been public, because of the public comments on a consent decree, it's not finalized yet. But they will be monitoring this site until I am dead. The railroad built an office there, and they're in it for the long haul. So to
Okay.
some extent, groundwater, because we didn't even talk, the water plant was upstream, so up gradient of this, but people were still very concerned, and so they will be monitoring this for decades.
Okay.
Which again, most you go to a typical spill site and you achieve your end goal and you're done. This will just continue on, and that's part of that question. Why?
That's a very philosophical question, Bill, and a very good way for us to end this webinar. And I'll turn it back over to Mark.
Thank you so much, Bill. I want to thank you for the very informative presentation. I hadn't heard you speak about this before, and it taught me things from the beer that was lost to the public concern and response to, that teasing out of legacy versus derailment contamination. Just thank you very much for putting this thorough presentation together.